Miss Rose's story time. We are reading Carry On, Mr. Bowditch, and we are on chapter 17. And this book is Carry On, Mr. Bowditch by Jean Lee Latham. So, Lunars in Moonlight. I want to hear all about everything, Nate, Elizabeth said. David Farrell smiled. We both do. Nate thanked them. He told Elizabeth he'd try to see her soon. When I get over feeling like a fool, he told himself. Just now, he said, he must go to the custom house with Captain Prince. Perhaps this evening, Elizabeth asked. It might be a week or two before he could see her, he said. He'd be awfully busy taking care of the cargo. For a moment, Elizabeth's eyes studied him gravely. Then she smiled and said it was fine. He was home. She left the wharf with David Farrell. After Captain Prince and Nate reported to the custom house, they went to Mr. Derby's office. Mr. Derby questioned them briefly and nodded. His mind did not seem to be on the success of the Astrea. He told them news of the war threat. The trouble with France dragged on. It'll never be settled until this country wakes up and builds a navy, Prince said. Mr. Derby nodded. President Washington knows we need a navy. He unfolded a newspaper. Here's what he said in his 8th annual message to Congress last December. He read some passages he had marked. To an active, eternal commerce, to the protection of the naval force is indispensable. It is in our experience that the most sincere nautical is not a sufficient guard against the depredations of nations at war. To secure respect to the neutral flag requires a naval force, organized and ready to vindicate it from insult and aggression. This may even prevent the necessities of going to war. Prince said, and he is right, but when will he convince Congress? They're finally convinced, Mr. Derby said. They've authorized the building of 6 frigates. Humph, Prince said. 6 frigates, Mr. Derby nodded. I know it is not enough. I'm urging the government to let private citizens build warships too. Salem will build a frigate the minute we have permission. Nate thought of what men said of Mr. Derby, that he could see around corners. Did he see war coming now, in spite of all our efforts to stay at peace? Mr. Derby's secretary interrupted to say that Mr. Blunt, the publisher from Newbury, wanted to see them. A moment later, an impatient young man entered the office, nodding briefly to Mr. Derby and Captain Brent, and glared at Nate. I was talking to Mr. Collins, he said. He tells me you think you found an error in Moore's navigation. I did. And what, to which table? Nate told him. Mr. Blunt gave a short laugh and relaxed. Do you know who complied that table? Neville Mesking, the Royal Astronomer of England. You'd be as apt to find a mistake in Newton's Principia, Nate said. I did find an error in it. Let's see if I can quote the spot. Well, roughly translate, it went something like this, and he quoted the passage and pointed out the error. Mr. Blunt's jaw fell. Well, I'll be. Where did you go to college? London? Paris? You didn't get that kind of education here. Where did you go? I didn't. Mr. Blunt opened his mouth twice before any sound came. Finally, he said, could you point out the error in Maclean's tablet? Which one? Nate asked. There were several. Mr. Blunt's round face swelled and turned red. At last he swallowed hard and muttered, all of them? Captain Prince said. And you might ask him about his new way of working lunars, Mr. Blunt. A new way of working lunars? Nate explained it briefly. Mr. Blunt's jaw dropped again. But that's tremendous. I'd like to include it in the new edition of more that I'm bringing out. And if you could just cast your eye over some of the tables in the book. You don't cast your eye over navigation tables, Nate barked. When I checked that one table of Mecklin's, I worked every figure 3 times, just to be sure I was right. 3 times? Every figure? But why and why not? Nate roared. Mathematics is nothing if it isn't correct. Men's lives depend on those figures. Mr. Blunt swelled up and turned red again, but after a little he said, Quite so, Mr. Bowditch. I wish we had time for you to check all the tables and more. At any rate, I certainly want to include your new method of taking lunars. Nate promised to see him in 2 weeks, when they'd taken care of their cargo. Soon, he, Captain Prince, and Mr. Derby were deep in figures. Time and again during the next 2 weeks, Nate thought of Elizabeth. Was he ready to see her now? Ready to feel like a big brother or father or something of the sort? He'd give himself a little more time, he decided. When he was alone checking on the cargo, he was glad he had another excuse to put off seeing her. He must talk to Mr. Blunt about Moore's Navigator. I wish we had time for you to check all the tables, Mr. Blunt repeated, but a great many of the signatures of the book are already printed. He must have seen Nate's bewilderment. He said, Perhaps you think of a signature as a man's name. We printers have another meaning for it. A signature is a single large sheet of paper on which certain pages of the book are printed. We arrange the pages so that when the signature is folded and trimmed, the pages are in order. Nate said he'd be glad to check some of the tables that weren't yet printed, glad of an excuse to keep busy, he thought. He worked on the tables, and the thought of Elizabeth stayed somewhere under the figures most of the time. I'm getting over it, he told himself, but every time there was a knock on the door, his heart jumped. Maybe it was a message from Elizabeth, but it never was. Dr. Prince came to see him. I just wanted to remind you, Nate, the psychological library, philosophical library is still open to you if you want to read the books. Nate thanked him. I've been thinking about the library, Dr. Price. I'd like to join it now, if it's all right with the members. More than all right. We'll be honored to have you. Dr. Prince's eyes twinkled. I'm sure the books will be pleased. No one else has ever understood them so well as you. Dr. Holyoke came wanting to hear all about the lunars firsthand and to talk astronomy with Nate. Nate felt a warm glow of pleasure. Dr. Holyoke was more than a beloved physician. He was one of the founders of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in Boston. I correspond with quite a few astronomers, Dr. Holyoke said, but I don't have much chance to talk to one. I'm no astronomer, Nate protested. That's a picture of the captain's walk. Turning to page 164. No, but you figured an easier and more accurate way to check longitude. Astronomers and scientists have been working on that quite a while, for several hundred years. The chronometer's the best way, Nate said, when all ships can afford a chronometer. Until they can, they'll bless you and your lunars even if you aren't an astronomer. Come to think of it, I believe a carpenter invented the chronometer, didn't he? Dr. Holyoke grinned and was gone. Along again, Nate tried to work, but it was no use. He really should call on the Boardman's he told himself. He should tell Mrs. Boardman about the man he met in Manila who known her husband. At the Boardman's, own Minna greeted Nat with a smile. And Boardman and the girls would be so sorry to miss him, she said. They were in Boston. Hard to tell when they would be back. Mrs. Boardman wrote that they were having a fine time. So many parties. David Farrell was in Boston, too. Nat went back to his work. Autumn came. The trees flamed scarlet and yellow. The harvest moon was gold. A note came for Nate in Elizabeth's handwriting. His fingers shook when he opened it. A group were going Thursday night to a farm for a party, Elizabeth wrote. The grown-ups will visit in Mr. Wiggins' house, but we're going to have a party in the barn, a husking bee, and Bob for apples and everything. I do hope you can come, especially. Nat went to sleep smiling. She wanted him especially. Thursday morning, he saw David Farrell. David was cheerful, too. We're awfully glad you can come, Nate. Think is just between us, but I'm hoping to make a very important announcement tonight. Are you? Nate realized how flat his words sounded. He forced himself to smile. That's fine. Nothing's settled yet, David said. So you won't tell anyone? Not a word, Nate promised. He went home with a cold lump in his chest where his heart should be. So that was why Elizabeth hoped he could come especially. He was to be among the first to know. Big brother, Nat muttered. It's a wonder David didn't ask my permission instead of her mother's. 5 times that afternoon he decided he wouldn't go. 5 times he changed his mind. At 7 o'clock that evening, he was alone in the crowd in Wiggins' barn. Not that anyone could tell how he felt. He was sure of that. He knew his face kept smiling all by itself. He'd given it a good talking to before he came. He knew his tongue kept making the right answers, but his thoughts were anywhere else, everywhere else. The party at Mary's, when he'd first talked to Elizabeth the morning after Liza's funeral, when Elizabeth had bought him a Latin book, most of all, the morning he sailed to the Astray, when Elizabeth told him goodbye, when Elizabeth stood on tiptoe. The crowd began husking corn. David called cheerfully, Here, Nat, sit by us. We've saved you a place. Nate's face smiled. His tongue said, Oh, fine. He sat by Elizabeth, husked corn, and smiled at David's constant stream of chatter. I haven't found a red ear yet, David complained. I should have bribed Mr. Wiggins to save me a dozen. He bent his head and looked into Elizabeth's face. You know what that means, me proud beauty. 13 kisses. A dozen is 12, Elizabeth said. Tell him, Nat. David laughed. I have a baker somewhere in my ancestors. I always give 13 kisses for a dozen. 1 for your right eyebrow, 1 for your left eyebrow, and Nate didn't realize his hands had stopped husking corn. An ear hit him on the chin. Someone yelled, Nat, get to work. Smiling again, Nate grabbed an ear of corn, ripped back the husk. The ear was red. A shout of laughter went up. Kiss her, Nate, kiss her! Nate's heart sank. When it time to kiss Elizabeth, he dreamed of this minute halfway around the world. In his dreams, they would have been alone, maybe looking at the stars. He would have told her the legend of Mecheno, and then somehow, he'd never figure out just how, he would have worked around to telling her that he loved her. But now, in the midst of 24 teasing, laughing people, he must kiss her and make a joke of it. He ordered his face to smile again and put his arm around her. He couldn't think of anything funny to say, so he borrowed David's words. Come here, my proud pretty beauty. She turned to him, laughing, and she was suddenly grave. Nate, she whispered. Nate found he didn't have to work around to what he wanted to say. He just said it. I love you, Elizabeth. I've always loved you since you were, and he kissed her. Another ear of corn hit Nate. Another voice. Here, Nate. Nate saw the ripped back husk and a red kernels. He laughed and tossed the ear on the pile of corn. Keep it. I don't need it. He pulled Elizabeth to her feet. Where's your mother? Elizabeth's eyes widened. In the house. Then come on, I have something to say to her. Excuse me. Outside the barn, Elizabeth stopped and leaned against the barn door. Let's just stand here a minute, Nate, until I get my breath. Nate chuckled, leaned his hand against the door, and stood watching her face in the moonlight. Is the moon that big everywhere, Nate? Nowhere but in Salem, he told her. Other places it's just, well, moon size. How big is moon size? He teased her. You really want to know? Or are you scared of your mother? I'm not a bit scared. I want to know about the moon. Well, Nate drawled, the closest estimation we have is that the diameter is 2,160 miles. Now shall we go? From the doorway, someone said, People are right. Figures do run out his ears, don't they? It was Polly. The three of them laughed together. She was stalling. I think she's scared of her mother, Nate said. Pooh! Aunt Mary won't argue about it, Polly said. She would have seen this coming for ages. Nate blinked. What? A woman can always tell about things like this. Nate teased her. A woman? Polly tossed her head. A girl, then. But a girl knows more about love before she's a woman than a man ever knows. She went back to the barn. Elizabeth said, Tell me some more about the moon, Nate. Nate chuckled. The radiance of the moon is special in Salem. It comes from your face. He stopped, pleased with himself. That was almost like poetry, wasn't it? I wish I could make pretty speeches. Elizabeth tucked her hand under her arm. Pretty speeches? When a man can make pretty speeches, I always wonder how long he's been practicing. Come on, Nate, let's tell Mother. In March, just before Nate's birthday, they were married. Yay! The months that followed were the happiest Nate had ever known. The only shadow that ever crossed their days came from news of the sea, a ship long overdue, a ship returning with word of missing men, a ship reported lost in action against the French, and men coming back with grim tales of storms off the Cape or the Horn. Then Elizabeth's eyes would darken with fear. Nate, I hope you never double the Cape again. I couldn't sleep thinking about it. The Cape's not so bad. You're safer there than lots of places. For instance, take the Mediterranean. There you'd be running from a French privateer and probably be hauled by a Barney pirate. And he told her horrendous tales of what happened to crews that were captured by the Barney pirates. Men put in chains, sold as slaves. Elizabeth finally agreed that perhaps the Cape wasn't so bad after all. Nate felt proud of himself, making a Mediterranean sound worse than the Cape. Captain Prince came to call. The Astra was sailing again in August. I want you as supercargo, Nate. And no more second mate's duty for you. No watches to stand. Nate grinned. I want to be worth my salt between ports. You are. You and your teaching. I've spent a long time at sea, but I've never had less trouble with a crew. So you'll come? Supercargo and all your time your own between ports? Now? Elizabeth protested. When there's so much trouble and with France? Prince shrugged it off. There's nothing to worry about. Do you think Derby would send the Astra now if he thought there was any danger? He knows things are quieting down. Elizabeth didn't look convinced. With all those frigates being built, the Constitution and the Constellation, and that's why things are quieting down, Prince declared. The best way to stay at peace is to be prepared for war. Elizabeth finally smiled. Of course, I'll remember that, and I hope you have a good voyage. Prince smiled. You're a proper mariner's wife, Elizabeth. You know an anchor won't hold if the cable's too short. A man's always needs another shot in the locker. Elizabeth's smile was puzzled. Another length of cable to stick out when a ship threatens to drag her anchor, Prince said. I'll remember that, Elizabeth promised. Good, Captain Prince smiled. Nothing to worry about. This is just a short trip to Cadiz, then into the Mediterranean to Alicante. He waved a gay salute and was gone. Into the Mediterranean, Elizabeth hailed and was silent. Nate couldn't think of anything to say either, not after all the stories he told her about the dangers of the Mediterranean. She said she had just thought of something and fled up the stairs. Nate started after her and then turned back, cursing himself for a fool. What could a man tell a woman about the sea so that she wouldn't worry? Elizabeth did not come downstairs again until supper. She was still pale, but she laughed and talked of everything but the sea. After supper, though, conversation lagged. Nate was glad when someone knocked. It was Lem Harvey, dressed in his best, with his wife and his brother-in-law, Zach Selby. The wife just had to see you, Mr. Bowditch, sir, Amanda Harvey said, to thank you for what you did for Lem. I can't tell you how much I thank you. My Lem signed on the Bestie as a second mate. Zach Selby sneered. You'd think he was running a whole fleet of ships single-handed to hear her take on. Sour grapes, Nate thought. Zach's still before the mast, and he's 10 years older than Lem. He said, I'm glad for Lem, Amanda, but I didn't do it for him. He did it for himself. He worked and studied harder than any man in the crew. That's just it, sir, Amanda said. Nobody else ever got him to stick his nose in a book. Zach sneered again. Books! Sailing men have to come a pretty pass when they have to sail my books. Time was the way, double the horn with nothing but log, lead, and lookout. That's right, Nate agreed. They doubled the horn, and sometimes they got home again. But what about all the ships that don't come home? If sailing by book makes men a little safer, what's wrong with it? Zach lowered his gaze and shuffled his feet. Ain't just my idea, he muttered. Plenty of men think that I think what I think. Sailing by books is mighty low-buried business. Amanda said, Oh, you don't pay any attention to him, Mr. Bowditch. His nose is out of joint. Lem and me were mighty proud of a book sailor in the Harvey family. When they had gone, Elizabeth smiled. I'm mighty proud of my supercargo in the Bowditch family. Nate, darling, forgive me for being such a coward this afternoon. I won't do it again, I promise you. 2 days later, Captain Price was back, not smiling this time. You and your teaching, he roared. Lem Harvey's ship as second mate on the Bestie. Elizabeth's eyes widened. But Captain Price, aren't you proud of him? Price flushed, then growled. Of course, just pleased to pieces. But blast it all, he was the best man we had on the guns. We needed him, and he stamped out. Elizabeth gasped. Nate, there's danger. He knows it. Oh, darling, she stopped. I'm sorry. I'm not going to spoil the rest of the time together. Nate hugged her. 10 years from now, we'll be laughing at this, won't we? Of course. No more solemn talk. She kept her promise until the August morning the Astra was to sail. Then she stared at Nate with stricken eyes. Nate, dear, goodbye, darling. Nate teased her gently. I'm going to teach you French. They say it is better, au revoir. That's still till you return. Goodbye always sounds so final. Elizabeth whitened. I didn't mean it that way, Nate. I didn't. But if it were goodbye, Nate, remember this. You've made me happier than any other girl ever was in the world. A chill tingled Nate's spine. He kissed her. Au revoir. Goodbye, Nate. Then quickly she added, I'll learn French when you come back. Nate smiled, but he felt a cold lump in his chest. That's the end of chapter 17. I hope you're enjoying Miss Rose's story time. Please like and share and let people know about this, people that are in nursing homes and hospitals and quarantined to their homes and things, so they can just have a moment to get lost in a book. All right. Thank you very much, and God bless you and keep you always. Thank you.